Around a year ago, a young Russian man, Alexander Zhadan, made headlines with the news that he found his girlfriend on Tinder and proposed her, all thanks to ChatGPT. He started looking for a girlfriend in 2022 and soon realized that it would be quite daunting with endless time spent on dating apps, repetitive conversations, and a lot of ghosting. He calculated that if he had done the dating spiel all by himself, it would have taken over 5 years and more than $155,000. So he decided to use ChatGPT, which at the time was far less advanced than it is now. The early models of ChatGPT made some mistakes, like inviting to a forest on the first date. The whole project took 120 hours to develop. API usage costed $1,432. Restaurant bills were around $2,300. And finally, AI found the one and only girl to whom Alexander eventually proposed, which was also suggested by AI, by the way. Alexander claimed that ChatGPT prepared short digests of online chats that he could briefly read before dates. AI suggested gifts, places to visit, and so on. In the viral Twitter thread where he revealed the story, he also posted a video where he awkwardly proposed to his girlfriend, who at the time already knew that for the most part she communicated with the AI, except for the times when they had more in-depth conversations. They seemed quite happy as a couple. I guess it's a total match, as she accepted him even after the revelation. Plus, turned out she's also into IT, so the experiment didn't bother her. But the reaction of the public was, as you would expect, quite different. The guy was called a psychopath and a freak, and the situation with the proposal was described as cringe. Many Twitter users claimed that by relying on AI, Alexander undermined the authenticity of the human connection and kind of failed people who put effort and their soul into chatting with him. But is the communication on the dating apps, at least at the initial stages, that authentic? See, I don't think so. Try being more sincere and unique on a dating app and see how that goes for you. Chances are you're going to be unmatched or blocked. Originality and authenticity do not land well on low-stakes dating apps filled with strangers. It's hard to make an original opener just based on very poor information that the profile gives, a huge amount of which is fake anyway. There are many videos online that make fun of how boring and formulaic communication on dating apps is. And I can always relate to that. Yeah, everyone says the same, so original, but then I look at my messages and I guess I could do a better job as well. So maybe AI can replace me. After starting to use Tinder in Shanghai, I'm totally in support of the usage of AI in online dating. I can definitely outsource the task of looking at profiles with half-hidden faces. Don't pretend to be shy. I know you are in a relationship or married. Gym pics that seem either fake or old, and my favorite, euphemisms that ultimately hide the truth that they all hope for a hookup. I need AI to reply to men who want a pal with the creepy invitations to the nearest forest, like in Alexander Zhadan's case. But in all seriousness, some men are so desperate, they probably won't even suspect anything. By the way, for those who are unfamiliar with the online dating culture in China, because I sure was not, here is a helpful dictionary. Just for the future, so that you won't think that there is a very wholesome profile and it's just a list of fetishes, or whatever this transactional thing is with guys saying that there are gonna be presents and money each date. The first time I stumbled upon it, I received a message from a guy that was worded very ambiguously, and I didn't understand who is paying whom for dates. Like, should I just come on a date with a humbao in one hand and baijiu in another? Sorry, I only have 50 yuan, how much can I get for that? I find it ironic that one of the most famous, at least on the internet, Slavoj Žižek's anecdotes is his talk about outsourcing sex in the future to technological devices that perform the act, while two people can just enjoy conversations without the anxiety of physical intimacy. Well, it turns out that it's the other way around. People are more ready to just skip this let's get to know each other step by outsourcing this to AI and just go straight to sex. In a way, I consider this dating case as an example of someone who put real effort into bypassing a lot of traps that dating apps put us in, where we spend our precious time and money on them. Alexander managed to find a suitable person who is on the same wavelength and likes his antiques, such as doing experiments for virality. In a way, this was an act of revolt, at least at the time. Now I see more and more profiles with clearly AI-generated bios, and I suspect that at some point I messaged with someone who had AI automatically writing to me each morning. And this is the only way of striving on apps these days. You should not take it very close to heart. Studies show that online dating turns into a game and is evaluated by some users as a form of entertainment rather than a serious pursuit of a romantic partner. The interface and haptics of these platforms, the way we swipe and touch the screen, make us more likely to treat other people behind profiles as commodities rather than actual human beings. Yes, dating apps turn romantic love into a commodity, but the idea that people approach dating as some form of marketing existed long before apps. Studies on the early internet dating websites already called it relation shopping. And frankly speaking, even before the internet, the institutionalized forms of relationship, such as marriage, were also approached as a commercial enterprise. Think about the bride show. Negotiations between families about the prospects of marriage. The only difference is that in the past, romantic love was not a necessary component of marriage. Thus, it was mating that was commodified, not erotic love. There is a general agreement that we live in a time of crisis of love. Something changed, even compared to 20 years ago. It seems like modern dating is broken for everyone, regardless of gender, age, and sexual orientation. A lot has been said about it. Op-eds, video essays, academic literature, just random rants on social media. Dating apps cause burnout, dating feels like a chore, it's not joyous, meetings that never happen, conversations hanging in the air, unreturned replies, ghosting. Finding love seems impossible. Some people blame dating apps for this problem altogether. Dating apps presented at some point the utopian promise of the digital built on a premise of the abundance of options. But nowadays it's quite obvious that they are simply low-trust platforms where people fling themselves upon the mercy of algorithms for the promise of getting at least something, a weave of intimacy. And you always have to be vigilant. Enjoying much of conversation, bam, you are ghosted. Studies show that the ghosting experience has had long-term negative effects on mental health, with a fairly large proportion of people who had been ghosted blaming the other person for ghosting them. For instance, Sarah Schulman in Conflict is Not Abuse recalls her painful experience of being ghosted by a woman after what seemed to be a very successful date. Schulman admits that the direct confrontation and explanation of why she was being rejected, however harsh it may be, is far less harmful than the state of ambiguity, the silence in the air. Got too comfortable and free with what you message, wrote something cringeworthy or bad? Congrats, you are screenshotted! Always keep in mind that whatever you send can be screenshotted and sent to a group chat or worse, somewhere public. Every time I stumble upon posts on Xiaohongshu with screenshots of messages, it sends chills down my spine. What if my messages will be shared like this? I think we need some kind of etiquette for this stuff. A dating app's code of conduct, if you will. In addition to this problem of mistrust in the dating apps, there is this confusion or at least some obfuscation around what exactly it is that makes people so unhappy with modern dating and dating apps. People talk about the crisis of love, but in reality the discourse around modern dating either revolves around how to get matches, make a better profile, get dates. That's basically all that the r/Tinder is concerned with, or is about how people do not want to commit and ghost. If you scratch the surface of all these videos, discussions online about how modern dating is broken, all this hypergamy, situationship, cringe messages, hookup culture, OnlyFans is ruining it, society, economics, politics, pornography, and I'm not saying that any of these things do not contribute to the current depressing state of dating. We will get into that. It's just that if you scratch all of the matters listed above, the real source of unhappiness is that people who you would pick do not pick you back. It has more to do with wounded pride, anger, and humiliation, rather than a concern about whether one can fall in love, whether one can love, or knows how to love. Tell me 3 words I want to hear most. In the second half of 20th century, there was a consensus, at least among social scientists and psychologists, that there are 2 types of romantic love, passionate and companionate. Passionate love is an intense emotional state of longing for union with another person, whereas companionate love is a calmer emotion of friendly affection and deep attachment. Passionate or erotic love is characterized by intrusive thoughts and fantasies that distract from everything else. This state is also what Dorothy Tanoff wrote about in detail in her 1979 book Love and Limerence, a book I highly recommend to everyone. According to some scholars, both types of love make sense from an evolutionary perspective, because passionate love is necessary to overcome fear and doubt about someone who is effectively a stranger, while companionate love helps to build life and raise a family. However, we also have to keep in mind how cultural and social norms play a role in our perception of this phenomenon. For example, in a society with arranged marriages, one cannot really speak about limerence or passion. For centuries, passionate love was sought outside marriage or vilified. This is why ancient Greek philosophers, when talking about Eros, rarely talk about marriage. This is why the ancient Chinese collection of poetry, the Book of Songs, in later prefaces negated the discourse of desire and passion in some poems. Medieval authors like Andreas Capellanus urged people to be more vigilant about passionate love. And this is why, when I was a student, a professor of cultural studies once told us that all modern problems with love start from Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, or when you allow your feelings of passionate love to intervene in a marriage. Of course, adultery among married couples existed long before the events described in Tolstoy's novel. It's just that Tolstoy introduced the scandalous plot twist. One can actually pursue their passionate love at the expense of marriage. An undeniable truth lies in the fact that if something is based on a contract between families, a social obligation, or a status protection, it is way more sustainable than something based on feelings. Though there is some brain scan evidence that supports the possibility of maintaining passionate love over time, the key is that passionate or erotic love is uncertain and unstable. It can last a month or a whole life. Tanoff in Love and Limerence also writes that divorce increased in 20th century partially as an inevitable consequence of selecting marriage partners by limerence. Quote, "The same logic that says marry where your heart leads also says divorce and remarry where your heart leads. This is why we need to have this twofold model of love to trick ourselves," oh, I'm getting so cynical right now, that these 2 types of love, passionate and companionate, can be exercised with the same person and even lead to successful relationships. And something that does not lead to a successful long-term relationship is marked as just the wrong type of love. Stendhal, in his own Infatuation, defines infatuation as putting someone on a pedestal and idolizing them but in reality it is nothing more than a process of enjoying oneself rather than another person. And once these self-inflictions start to get a bit tiring, the idol falls. Using modern jargon, you get the ick from your crush. What people like Stendhal and also Erich Fromm in his The Art of Loving mean is that sometimes what we perceive as passionate or erotic love has nothing to do with another person and more to do with the possession of the other. This is what distinguishes a mere obsession or infatuation with eroticism. Dorothy Tanoff in Love and Limerence also writes, quote, "The goal of limerence is not possession, but a kind of merging, a oneness, the ecstatic bliss of mutual reciprocation." In his 1957's Eroticism, Georges Bataille describes eroticism as ascending to life even in death. Here lies the paradox. Eroticism is an exuberance of life, but it is also linked to death, because the ultimate connection, the desire to merge forever, can only be directed towards death. Meanwhile, during our lifetime, the only thing accessible to us as a resemblance of this unity is to experience, quote, dizziness together. For Bataille, the point of eroticism is the destruction of the self-contained character, a disturbance of one's normal life. I think this process of the disturbance of normal life is best illustrated in an early 20th century movie, After Death, based on Ivan Turgenev's short story Clara Milic, where the protagonist, a young scientist, becomes the limerent object of a very sensual and sensitive actress who discloses her feelings to him. The protagonist is a romantically inexperienced man and considers himself a person guided by rationality. So this directness scares him and he rejects the woman and later learns that she committed suicide. Now all of the protagonist's thoughts are about this woman. He starts to learn details about her life, acquires her photograph and a page from her diary, and he slowly falls in love that soon resembles madness. All his guards fall. His views are shattered by this strong feeling. Unable to endure this separation, the protagonist slowly descends into madness and dies with a smile on his face. The reunion happens after death. Like the protagonist at the beginning of the short story, a lot of people believe that the erotic love can be tamed by rationality. In Love and Limerence, Tanoff writes that a lot of her respondents shared the sentiment that limerence can be stopped if only they caught it in the right moment. Since there are no guarantees that your feelings will be reciprocated, why not just shelter yourself? For the same reason, a lot of people are ready to submit to situationships and low commitment dating with no strings attached.
I am sad. You don't love me.
Erotic love was always difficult. For most of history, people didn't even have the privilege of mating with someone they were affectionate about, regardless of their sexuality. Yet recently, thinkers like Illouz point out that the dominance of love and sexual freedom in people's mating strategies introduced new barriers, such as competitiveness, economics, the fantasy of pure pleasure, and sovereignty. In Why Love Hurts, Illouz writes that when choices are abundant, it's easier just not to choose at all, and instead focus on yourself. But this advice is a bit misleading, because it substitutes love with self-love, negating the social nature of valuing oneself. Another aspect that Illouz mentions is that modern love is domesticated. There is no risk or daring. What we have instead are emotional and cultural scenarios of certain anticipations in romantic relationships. And the problem is that these scenarios are contradictory. On the one hand, we desire this unity, shared hobbies, and leisure time. Yet we consider routine, mundane tasks as boring and as a lack of novelty in the relationship. So there seems to be the conflict between adventure and security. But what we now understand as security is the shared organization of everyday life and leisure time, constant communication of emotions in relationships, while in the past, the time people spent together in marriage was much more segregated. So there is this fantasy that is impossible to fulfill, to find someone who matches us completely, who mirrors ourselves, yet also introduces novelty and adventure to our lives. Fantasy and imagination are becoming ends in themselves. Speaking about romantic fantasies, I almost forgot. Pornography. A lot of thinkers point out that pornography is a profanation of Eros, and it also kills fantasy and desire. Jean Baudrillard in Seduction talked about how what bothers him about pornography is that by means of technology, it provides us with POVs that never ever were accessible to people in real life. It can make close-ups and angles that cannot be observed when someone is participating in the act. It unveils everything, even something one didn't know could be unveiled, preventing us from being able to fantasize, seduce, and be seduced. What thinkers like Baudrillard, Giorgio Agamben, and Byung-Chul Han mean by pornography should not be reduced solely to lewd media from a well-known website. Anything can become pornographic if we reduce the distance and zoom in. Anything where the distinction between private and public is messed up becomes pornographic. Reality TV shows, vlogs, when we share our lives online, are pornographic in this regard. This whole discourse is not done for the sole purpose of being prudish and an old man yelling at clouds. Thinkers like Bataille, for instance, didn't want to police desires or transgressions of others. The problem here is that pornography is not a transgression which transcends taboo. And I have a video about Bataille's concept of transgression on my Bilibili channel, so if you're interested you can check this out. Maybe one day I will upload this on YouTube too. For Bataille, transgression is an important part of eroticism as much as death. But pornography is safe. And here I don't mean pornography as an industry, I mean pornography in a more metaphorical sense. It is low stakes, at least for the consumer. It is comfortable to observe the private lives of others. It deritualizes and desacralizes the private sphere and intimacy. And now we are where we are. We have a mid-discourse as a result of the oversaturation of highly stimulating and heavily edited imagery, a complete mismatch between what people claim to find attractive online and how people form couples in real life. And don't forget about oversharing by exposing DMs. The intimacy becomes a display. The desire is not something that you actively pursue, it is something readily available, like a convenience store meal. As Byung-Chul Han in The Agony of Eros puts it, this overabundance stifles fantasy. The expectations are high, the disappointment is soul-crushing. Speaking about disappointment, I think that there is another player in the field of modern dating that I don't see mentioned that often in this context. And it's this cute little emotional state called Ressentiment, popularized by the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Ressentiment is an excessive paranoid sense of victimization that justifies vindictive, spiteful attacks on those the subject mistakenly believes to be responsible for his or her suffering. Even though Friedrich Nietzsche is considered a trailblazer of this concept, he was not the first one to introduce it as a philosophical and psychological term. Nietzsche's contemporary, another German philosopher, Eugen Düring, argued that the concept of justice originated in the impulse to retaliate against those who wronged us. Düring used the French word ressentiment, which does not have an analog, meaning a bitter memory of something or the desire to take revenge for being wronged. Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality was in a way a response to Düring's thesis. For Nietzsche, justice cannot be reduced to revenge impulses, nor is ressentiment as simple of a concept as a desire for revenge. It's not a coincidence or just a personal quirk that Nietzsche used a French word, and it is sometimes overlooked in the discourse around ressentiment. It is not simply envy, which for Nietzsche is an emotion that can be productive and motivate to do something, nor is it resentment, an angry reaction for being wronged that can be a driving force for positive social change. Ressentiment is not revenge, since ressentiment is a desire to retaliate, but it misses the initial source of suffering. So Nietzsche used this word to mark a mental attitude that arises when vengeful impulses lose their touch with the object, and then these impulses actively create values. Nowadays, ressentiment is applied to explain a variety of social phenomena, and this is what I think is very interesting. Francis Fukuyama, in his recent essay 100 Days of Ressentiment, uses the term to diagnose recent Trump's policies and the reaction of Trump's supporters to them. I recently read a book by Leonid Fishman, Inequality of Equals, the Concept and Phenomenon of Ressentiment, that considers BLM protests as an example of ressentiment. So who are the real agents of ressentiment? Well, it depends on who you ask. So there is this tendency to use ressentiment as a blaming tool. But this is not paradoxical if we remember that for Nietzsche, ressentiment already happened. It is omnipresent as society reaches more equality, at least formally. No one is completely immune to it. Good news are that Nietzsche also believed that one can overcome this mental state. We all have the instinct of ressentiment, but we can also resist it. Ressentiment does not only appear in the sphere of politics, but also in the romantic erotic realm. And the peculiar part is that ressentiment in a way is the opposite of Eros. Because lack generates Eros. One can remember Plato's Symposium, where it is mentioned that Eros is directed towards something that we lack. But ressentiment generates lack, with the end goal of preserving this lack. As a lot of people already pointed out, black-pilled incel community is the example of ressentiment. Men who are unsuccessful in their romantic pursuits create a worldview that affirm their deprived state and misattributes, frankly justifiable grievances to their own causes. But if you take a closer look at the modern dating scene, you will see more examples of this, quote, psychological dynamite. Do you remember the AI dating case that I began this video with? Well, I didn't tell it then, but a lot of people were unhappy with the filters Alexander Jardin had for girls that AI should swipe left on, like stating their astrology sign. And I found the negative reaction to this particular aspect kind of telling about how people perceive modern dating. Because I thought that when we put some info on a profile, we give clues by which other people might choose us or not. Why would you want to be swiped right by a person who despises your interests? And all of the filters that Alexander made were actually about people's interests, political views, or such things as the number of people in profile pictures. These are not biases about inherent characteristics that people cannot change. And I'm sure these exact women who were so pressed about this guy filtering out those who are into astrology can also filter men based on height, for example. So it's filtering for me, but not for thee. What we have here is the idea that not being liked or picked by someone who you might not even be interested in the first place is offensive. I think this is very illustrative of what Gilles Deleuze wrote in Nietzsche and Philosophy. Quote, "The man of ressentiment doesn't know how to and doesn't want to love, but wants to be loved." Eros is the antidote to ressentiment. In the Agony of Eros, Byung-Chul Han makes the following diagnosis. We substitute love that dares to discover the radical other at the expense of self-negation for a more corporate, neoliberal, productive, comfortable attraction of sameness. In other words, we live in the times of the erosion of the other. Here, Han adheres to the concept of French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas and his work on the ethics of the other, capital O. The other as a philosophical category refers to someone who is not me. For instance, for the existentialist French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, the other delineates the boundaries of the self. The other also affirms and recognizes the self. Without the other, the self is incomplete. But if for Sartre the other is hostile, for Levinas, the new can only be introduced by the other, and only when this other is perceived precisely as the other. In this regard, for Levinas, Eros is not the struggle or fusion or complete knowledge of the other, it is the acceptance of the mystery of the other. Quote, "It's like a game with something slipping away, a game absolutely without project or plan, not with what can become ours or us, but with something other, always inaccessible, and always still to come. And one cannot dissolve into the other because that would mean evading responsibility. As much as the other, the self is irreplaceable, and no one can answer in my place." Now that I think about it, the second end of Evangelion is very Levinasian. When Shinji goes against uniting in a single consciousness with others, wow. Back to Byung-Chul Han. So he uses this Levinasian notion of the other to contrast it with how today all of these problems that I discussed previously, such as focusing solely on the self, lack of distance, desire to stay in comfort zone, and commodification of erotic love, all lead to the cancellation of the other. We do not seek the other anymore. Eros takes the subject out of him or herself towards the other. But if there is no other, the subject retreats into oneself. For Han, the cancellation of Eros is not simply a problem of mating. It is a political, epistemological, and existential problem. Without courage, no changes can happen. Without Eros, logos is just reactive thinking. Without the other, the self ceases to exist. And I find these reflections on the other very sobering. Everyone wants the power to affect others and not be affected, to attract others and not be attracted. What I'm afraid of is the complete entrapment of the self. I just don't want to end up like the protagonist of the novel by Carl Huysmans that I recently read. It's an 1884 novel called Against Nature, where the protagonist retreats into his own ideal aesthetic world to escape the society that he loathes. The life he builds is a total and complete reflection of his own aesthetic tastes and interests. He did the work on himself, he focused on himself. But in this world that he carefully crafted, there is no one else. So yeah, maybe things don't really work out the way we wish. But like an unsuccessful startup that rented an office, went bankrupt but gained invaluable experience, we have to carry on because there is a chance to meet the other.